is the living inmates. They're wrong. In 2014, a correctional officer named Marcus took a graveyard shift at Eastern State Penitentiary. Cell Block 12 had been welded shut since 1974 after a brutal inmate riot. But at exactly 3:14 a.m., Marcus didn't just hear scratching coming from inside the rusted iron door. He heard his own dead mother's voice whispering his childhood nickname from the darkness. If you think old prison walls only hold regret, what happened next will prove they hold something much worse. Don't blink, because the entity trapped in Cell Block 12 is still looking for a way out. The graveyard routine. The fluorescent lights of the corridor hummed with a sick, flickering yellow vibration that gave Marcus an instant, throbbing headache behind his left eye. He hated the graveyard shift at Eastern State, a sprawling, decaying concrete fortress built in the late 19th century that smelled permanently of whetstone, old copper rust, and the metallic tang of dried sweat. At 2:45 a.m., the prison was a tomb of silence, save for the occasional distant, hacking cough of an inmate sleeping 3 tiers down, or the heavy, rhythmic thud of Marcus's own black tactical boots striking the cold linoleum floor. He carried a heavy Maglite flashlight in his right hand, its beam cutting a sharp white circle through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air, while his left hand rested nervously on the heavy ring of iron keys clipped to his duty belt. The air grew progressively colder as he walked deeper into the eastern wing, away from the modernized control center and toward the abandoned historical sectors that the state refused to spend money on renovating. The temperature gauge on the concrete wall read 52 degrees Fahrenheit, but Marcus could see his own breath blooming in front of his face in pale, ghostly clouds that vanished into the shadows. Every guard on the force knew the stories about the Eastern Wing, tales of shadow figures walking across the catwalks, the sound of phantom heavy chains dragging along the iron grating, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes hidden behind the dark, empty cell bars. Marcus had always laughed those stories off during day shifts over lukewarm coffee with the other guards, calling them the overactive imaginations of bored men working long hours in the dark. But now, alone in the suffocating quiet of the third tier, with the silence pressing against his eardrums like heavy water, the laughter felt incredibly distant and foolish. He paused at the end of the corridor, shining his light down a long, narrow staircase that led to the sub-basement solitary confinement units, a place the old-timers called the Hole, where men were once left in total darkness for weeks until their minds completely shattered into violent madness. The darkness at the bottom of those stairs seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight, refusing to reflect anything back, standing like a solid block of black ink that waiting patiently for him to take a single step forward into its cold, unforgiving grip. The sound in the concrete, Marcus turned away from the sub-basement stairs, his heart thumping a jagged rhythm against his ribs as he forced himself to continue his mandated perimeter walk towards Cell Block 12. This particular block was a dead-end corridor containing 10 archaic cells that had been permanently decommissioned and welded shut over 40 years ago after a localized, bloody uprising that resulted in multiple casualties. The heavy iron door at the entrance of the block was secured with 3 thick steel welds that looked like ugly, jagged scars across the metal seam. As Marcus approached the threshold, a sudden, Violent vibration rippled through the concrete floor beneath his boots, so intense that it rattled the heavy iron keys on his belt with a sharp, metallic clinking sound. He froze instantly, his muscles locking tight, his ears straining against the heavy silence of the corridor to identify the source of the structural disturbance. Then, the sound began. A slow, deliberate, agonizing scratching noise that sounded exactly like human fingernails dragging across the rough, unyielding concrete on the internal side of the welded door. It started near the top of the frame, roughly 6 feet high, and slowly scraped its way down to the floor, leaving a high-pitched, screeching resonance that set Marcus's teeth on edge and sent a freezing wave of goosebumps cascading down his arms. He held his breath, leaning his head slightly closer to the cold steel surface, telling himself it was just a large rat nesting in the old plumbing lines, or the natural settling of the massive, century-old building's foundation. But rats do not scratch with the rhythmic cadence of a human hand. And rats do not stop scratching the exact moment you tap your heavy metal flashlight against the exterior wall to scare them away. The scratching stopped instantly when Marcus's flashlight struck the brickwork, followed by an agonizingly long silence that lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Then came a heavy, open-handed thud against the interior center of the door that was so violent the rusted iron frame groaned under the impact, causing Marcus to jump backward 2 full feet, his flashlight beam wild and erratic against the ceiling as he struggled to maintain his balance on the slick floor. The call from the dark. The heavy thud echoed down the empty corridor, a booming sound that should have awakened the entire prison block, yet the rest of the facility remained unnervingly silent, as if the sound were trapped within a localized pocket of reality. Marcus stood with his chest heaving, his hand trembling so violently that the white circle of his flashlight beam danced erratically across the welded seams of cell block 12. He reached for the heavy black radio strapped to his shoulder, intending to call the central control desk to report an attempted breach or structural anomaly. But when he pressed the talk button, the device emitted nothing but a loud, piercing burst of static electricity that sounded like tearing paper. Through the harsh white noise of the malfunctioning radio, a faint, low frequency began to bleed through the speaker, a wet, bubbling sound that gradually resolved into the distinct cadence of a human voice whispering through a throat choked with fluid. The voice was incredibly faint, a dry, raspy hiss that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and echo directly inside the hollow spaces of his skull. Marcus dropped the radio, the plastic casing clattering loudly against the floorboards, as he stared in absolute horror at the speaker, which was still crackling with an unnatural, blue-tinted static charge. The voice on the radio shifted, losing its metallic distortion, becoming terrifyingly clear, warm, and familiar. It was the exact voice of his mother, Clara, who had passed away in a hospital bed from terminal cancer over 5 years ago. "Marky, it's so cold down here in the dark," the voice whimpered through the static, using the specific childhood nickname that nobody else alive knew or had ever used. "They won't let me leave, Marky. They're tearing at my clothes. Please unlock the door and let your mama out." Marcus felt the blood drain completely from his face, leaving his skin ice cold and numb as a profound, paralyzing terror gripped his limbs, preventing him from running away from the radio that was currently desecrating the memory of his dead mother with its impossible, nightmarish transmission. "Mom, the vision In the mirror, driven by a desperate, panicked need to escape the whispering radio, Marcus sprinted down the corridor and ducked into the staff restroom at the end of the hall, slamming the heavy wooden door behind him and throwing the deadbolt lock with a loud click. He leaned over the white porcelain sink, splashing freezing tap water onto his face in an attempt to shock his system out of what he desperately hoped was a severe, sleep-deprived hallucination brought on by exhaustion. He kept his eyes closed for a long moment, listening to the steady, dripping sound of the leaky faucet before slowly opening his eyes and looking up into the cracked, silver-backed glass mirror above the basin. The reflection he saw did not belong to the brightly lit, tiled restroom he was currently standing in. Instead, the glass showed the interior of a dark, cramped stone cell with no windows and walls covered in dark, wet mold. In the center of that reflected cell, sitting on a rusted iron cot with her back turned toward him, was a figure wearing the exact faded floral nightgown his mother had been buried in. Marcus tried to scream, but his throat seized up, producing nothing but a dry, rattling gasp as the figure in the mirror slowly began to rotate its head backward toward the glass, far past the natural physical limits of the human neck. The face that finally stared back at him through the glass was not his mother's. The skin was a bruised, decaying gray. The eyes were completely gone, leaving only empty, weeping black sockets, and the jaw was unhinged, hanging open down to the chest in a silent, yawning cavern of absolute blackness. The entity in the mirror raised a skeletal, dirt-caked hand and pressed its palm flat against the internal surface of the glass, causing thin, spider-web cracks to radiate outward from its fingers across the real mirror in the restroom, accompanied by the distinct smell of burning sulfur and rotting meat. The aftermath. Marcus didn't remember breaking through the restroom door, nor did he remember sprinting past the welded gates of cell block 12 or screaming into the central security office with his uniform torn and his eyes wide with madness. He was found by the morning shift supervisor at 6:15 a.m., curled into a tight fetal position in the main security sally port, his fingers raw and bleeding from clawing at the reinforced glass door in his frantic effort to escape the building. He was placed on immediate administrative leave, and the prison administration officially chalked the incident up to an acute psychotic episode brought on by severe sleep apnea and occupational stress. 3 weeks later, a specialized maintenance crew was brought into Eastern State to inspect the structural integrity of the abandoned Eastern Wing before its scheduled demolition. When the workers used oxyacetylene torches to cut through the heavy steel welds of cell block 12 for the first time in 42 years, they expected to find nothing but dust, cobwebs, and empty concrete cells. Instead, they discovered something that defied all logic and terrified the seasoned construction crew to their very core. The internal walls of the entire block were covered in thousands of deep, fresh scratches that had been gouged directly into the solid concrete. Found directly behind the main welded entrance door was a single, heavily decayed black plastic security radio, identical to the model Marcus had dropped during his shift, its battery long dead, but its plastic casing still smelling faintly of old sulfur. Marcus never returned to law enforcement, moving across the country to a small desert town in Arizona where it never rained and where he refused to live in any house that had a mirror or a basement. The eastern wing of the prison was eventually demolished, but the guards who worked the remaining blocks still claim that on rainy nights, the security radios still crackled to life on their own, broadcasting a low, weeping voice that begs someone to open a door that no longer exists.